There are several other models of plot structure that have been developed from Propp's initial findings. And one of these that we took on in the Heroes and Heroines lecture is the journey of the hero. It's also known as the monomyth theory, argued by Joseph Campbell, that is a unified story structure to describe all heroic epic trajectories. It features a departure, climactic conflict where the protagonist has a revelation and then returns with an elevated status in this elixir. It is a formulaic way of producing stories that George Lucas heavily promoted in the late 70s and early 80s, and it has been highly influential in the film industry, where a repetitive structure helps the audience cue in on subtle differences or simply enjoy the familiarity of the story again with these superficial changes. So with this model, we can identify some of the archetypes, figures that Propp referred to as dramatis personae, that include the grandmother as the threshold guardian, animals as the helpers, the cat as the mentor, death and rebirth while enslaved by the witch. Then with their escape, we see their transformation and ultimate return to their father, now who has become a central part in their father's life again. If we want to reduce the structure of the story even further, then we could focus on the one common element of all stories, that is the protagonist. The renowned author Kurt Vonnegut examined stories in their emotional content and found that the plots direct emotion with 3 basic variants, and then with their reversals, leading him to 6. And these include the rise, fall, rise, also known as the Cinderella, the steady fall, also known as tragedy, the fall, rise, fall, also known as the Oedipus story arcs. They're all also, in addition to these common tales, then the steady rise, also known as the rags to riches, fall, then rise, also known as man in a hole, and finally the rise, then fall, also known as Icarus. The data analysis of over 41,000 books by Matthew Jockers, which he calls the Suizet package, it lends support to Vonnegut's theory, and thus we have entered big data as applied to the analysis of literature. Knowing the category of a book, tale, or basic plot structure, well, it tells us absolutely the very least amount of information about a story. It reduces it to a point where the story is no longer really enjoyed, but a data set. And even experimental novels capture the gist of a story arc. So they all kind of fall into these categories. The only thing that throws off his artificial reading intelligence is when irony or satire is used. So a sense of humor then is what sets an actual reader apart from an artificial one. Usually, however, irony or satire is not sustained, but there we may have the 7th story arc, the ironic, where it is assumed that the opposite is true of what one has said. Another developed reductive categorization for story structures is one that focuses on cinematic plots. And Christopher Booker identifies 7 basic plots that carry some familiar names like Aristotle's One Comedy and Tragedy, and Vonnegut's Rags to Riches, and then he veers away into what are subcategories really of the Campbell's journey of the hero, with 1, the quest, overcoming the monster, rebirth, and then voyage and return. In this sense, the basic plots that Booker identifies blends plot or sequencing of the story with the story arc that focuses on the emotional content. So with the monomyth, which defines the heroic tradition and begins renaming and reducing these functions and stages of Propp and Campbell into 5 broader sequences, which include 1, anticipation of events, 2, dream, living the dream, 3, that frustration of the dream, 4, the how that becomes into a nightmare, and 5, its resolution. So if we look at how that might work to structure something like The Princess Bride, then we can anticipate that the love between Wesley and Buttercup turns into the dream that they will be together. Frustration arrives in the form of the forced engagement to Prince Humperdinck, Wesley's death and other complications, eventually escalating into a nightmare vision of the false marriage, eventually resolved by her rescue. And while each new reductive theorist attempts to apply new shackles of categorization to vastly different genre, mediums, and audiences, the field of neuroscience has boiled it down even further into perhaps the simplest of structures, a story format that we use to position ourselves in our own stories, and one that can easily be applied to analyze the political leanings of any news channel. This is the rescue narrative that is needed to understand the emotional component of words like tax relief. The rescue narrative contains a persecutor, a rescuer, and a victim. And the word tax relief implies an oppressive force in the form of those who might raise taxes, so this villain or oppressor, and a victim in the form of those being taxed, inferred here unfairly so that they need relief, and a rescuer in the form of those who are proposing to reduce taxes. So most stories include these three characters, and in the social negotiation of roles, there are those who quickly move from one category to the other. A persecutor we have seen throughout history will often want to quickly refashion themselves as a victim themselves or a rescuer of others. The rescue narrative is at work in the drama triangle of relationships that have been ended sourly, and there's often some shared contribution to relationships' demise from both parties, and realizing one's part in the end of a relationship can help a person grow. But for some, this opportunity for introspection is replaced with a story arc that has a stronger emotional component. In these cases, the former interest is positioned as a persecutor, while the new interest is being offered the role of rescuer. As the drama cycle continues, the rescuer will be made into the persecutor as the new interest is made into the rescuer. The problem with generalizing within genre, like the fairy tale, is that there are rules of recognition that keep many of the structural elements stable and simplified given the intended audience. Often complicating these moves the tale into an adult realm, and quite often this is done through genre blending, so that the complexity is derived from the discordant and alignment of elements within the two genre traditions that can be recognized and then played with. The crime and fairy tale genre work well together because of the focus on punishment in the grim tales that saw the tales as a form of case law. So the media may also play a decisive role in this, as a tale told over TikTok perhaps might be too simplistic to really tell given its time constraints. So just as tales told in person to children need structure to assist in letting them pay their attention to those specific details that are coming to them. Film as well is known as the art of the illiterate, and its reliance on visual iconography, their desire for a return on investment, and really the predominance of spectacle often leads to a cinematic reliance on well-worn story structures that contain very little surprises and invite audiences to be entertained and to enjoy a very familiar experience. So perhaps that is why the story structure is so identifiable in film, and as you've moved further into literature, it gets more complicated.